And then I just want to make sure I have my notes right. Cindy and Sean, you're going to be doing your chapter together, correct?
That's right.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah,
And
now that the recording's on, we all got very quiet.
Well, Cindy and Kathy, I'm sure you've noticed that it's a slim panel of authors tonight, so feel free.
What's up?
Freely. Vacations, all that tourism we're talking about. Yeah.
That's okay. We'll have a conversation. It'll be awesome.
Yeah. Right.
Fine.
I just wanted to tell you not to hold back. You have all the time you want.
Okay, you're going to go over. You're going to speak for all of us at first, though, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm just going to introduce. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, Matt.
Never try to speak for you, Cindy.
Everything's open and ready to go. You might just give it a couple minutes to let folks get in because they have to click in.
Sure.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Matt, for organizing this.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining on, the summertime. Like a few of us have shared, it's been a heck of a year, and to jump onto a webinar on a Wednesday evening and, at the start of summer, I appreciate it.
Well, summer hasn't started here yet in Canada, so it's pouring rain out there, and it was 12 degrees yesterday. So, Celsius.
Okay. Oh.
But then we also had 29 the week before, so it's Alberta. Anyway, Sean Daly, I'm really going to say I'm really pleased to meet you virtually, and I know Cynthia and Elisa well. I know Elisa really well, Cynthia a bit, so it's nice to meet you online, as well as the rest of you guys. So thank you so much for making this all work.
Yeah, I think we're in the same time zone too. So if you're in, are you in BC or you're in Alberta? Where are you?
Alberta.
Okay, no, we're not in the same time zone. I'm over in Oregon.
I'm so sorry for you. Not one of the most beautiful places in the world.
Oh, you're in a beautiful place too.
Yeah, Alberta is wonderful.
Oh my gosh.
And we have some folks in the chat joining us from Baltimore.
Oh, yay, Charm City.
Folks all over the place.
Good.
Let's see.
Oh,
Houston, Texas. So we're well represented geographically so far.
I was just in Chile 2 years ago. Well, if you don't count last year, a year.
Yeah, right. We don't count
The last time we could
happen.
travel. Beautiful country. I definitely have to go back and play more. I've gotten very fond of Central and South America because you don't have jet lag. You just fly straight down. It's great.
Sure. So if it's all right, I think we're going to have some folks coming in as we get started, but we'll go ahead and kick our evening off just so that we can get you all out of here within the hour, because we're very appreciative of your time. So I want to welcome everyone in and thank you for joining our June Network and Learn. My name is Matt Love. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Special Education at San Jose State, and I'm a member of the IRN's Professional Learning Committee. On the panel here, I also have Mackenzie from the IRN and Kelly, who's on the PL committee with us. She's going to help us interact with you in the chat and kind of help coordinate our Q&A. I'm also joined by the folks that we're going to have a conversation with tonight, the editor and some of the chapter authors of the recently published book, Critical Issues in Universal Design for Learning. So I can show you all, I bought it, I read it, so I appreciate you all being here. Like we said, for some of us, it's the kickoff of summer, and we hope to enjoy an evening of light conversation and just to talk through some of the sections and chapters of the book. Like I said, I was able to go through it from both a research and a practitioner perspective. I found the book to be informative, and again, hope the conversation that we have tonight is just as informative to our attendees. And maybe we can give them some required reading as they're kicking off their own summers. I know I have some of my own students that I invited to watch now, and I'll probably use the recording in the future. So lots of required reading coming forward. Our panelists are going to be leading the conversation tonight, and I'll let them introduce themselves as they talk about their chapters, just so we can keep the night flowing. And for the most part, I'm just going to be here to guide the conversation and transition from different speakers, which is probably a good thing. In our PL committee meeting earlier, I said last time I led one of these, YouTube crashed and we were kind of scrambling. So I'll just get out of the way and, hope nothing wrong happens. And just to let everyone know how tonight's going to work, again, we just want it to be a smooth flowing, informal conversation. Talk about the different chapters and sections with the folks that are here. And then time permitting, we do want to have a Q&A. So if you use the chat or the Q&A function for us to be able to bring questions forward to the folks that are here with us, that would be the easiest way. And we're going to save questions for the end, just so that we have a nice flow and we're able to facilitate the conversation pretty smoothly. We ask that if you have a specific question for the author, please mention that in your question, or if it's just a general question that we can ask to the entire panel, let us know there. And remember, we also encourage you to interact with us on Twitter. So we'll drop the Twitter handle and hashtag there for you as well. So with that, I kind of want to just open with Elisa, the editor of the book, ask her a few questions, and then we'll jump right in to our chapters. So Elisa, if you're ready, I can ask you kind of the first question I have for you tonight.
I am ready.
Sure. So like I said, I think the book is really informative for both practitioners and researchers. As the editor, why would you recommend the book to those folks in either the practitioner or research-based education?
So yeah, this is a great question. I will forever consider myself a practitioner. I've had this conversation with my dean multiple times. When you're a teacher, when that's what you've trained for, when that's what you do, that's sort of who you are in your soul. And so I definitely feel that way as I look at all the work that I do. That being said, this book was written, we didn't really do an overview of the book, but this book was written with the idea that I didn't have a lot of the answers that I needed, or I felt like I needed, related to UDL. UDL in practice, UDL in implementation, UDL in research. And I was thinking about who did I know, or who were the people that I knew that worked in these areas that might have conversations to contribute to that. And in truth, many of the conversations that show up in the book, many of the invites that I issued out for chapters were because of conversations we had had over coffee or over whatever. So as far as practitioners go, that is not the focus of the book. However, it's not that practitioners should be excluded from reading the book. Of course not, because practitioners are truly the most important audience outside of students that we serve, right? Outside of students and their families. And so practitioners are in the unique position of delivering these services that are recommended by research to individuals and their families. And they're in the unique position of actually having to know the evidence for those procedures and defend them on a day-to-day basis, right? They have to be able to say why they're doing what and with whom and for what reason on a day-to-day basis. And so it is incredibly important that we be transparent in all that we do research-wise, by including practitioners, by absolutely listening and really stepping back and following the direction of practitioners in many ways. And I think that this book leads to some critical thinking, which was the whole point, that will be helpful for people to think through and reflect on as they implement their practice. I guess that's the best way I could say that for practitioners. For researchers, I mean, really the whole idea for researchers is I was just hoping to prompt some new and novice conversations and some deeper looks into into current practice and what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing what we're doing. I think it's our job. Inquiry is our job, right? Inquiry and dissemination. And so this idea of taking a complex and critical approach to UDL implementation, just to UDL in general, to the framework in general, and to all of those practices that have sprung up around UDL that are somewhat more belief oriented than they are evidence oriented. I think our work behooves us, just the definition of who we are as researchers, that's what we should be doing. But the primary audience that this book was written for was for students, for young researchers who are just going out into the field, who are starting to critically think about UDL and to think about their own work and how that might affect practice and how that might affect implementation. And I honestly was hoping to have a conversation that really looked at this. We do a good job with looking at the strengths of UDL. We really do. We, as a field, we almost cheerlead them at times, as I say in the book. But we haven't done such a good job as being transparent about the challenges there, about the things that really need further inquiry, that need further investigation, that need more transparency. And I was hoping to offer some really provocative questions to students that would inspire their own thoughts. Because I always believe it's the people that come behind us that are going to figure all this out, right? Whatever it may be. I hope that we are such teachers that we can promote inquiry in a way that those that come after us figure out the things we couldn't figure out. And that's my hope, is that young as in novice researchers will take this on. And I mean, I don't care if you're at home and you're reading this and you say, she's crazy. This is not right. That's fine. Prove it. That's my point, is just prove it all. That would be fantastic. And I would be so happy if people really took this text and provocatively questioned much of the things that are in it, in terms of not just a discussion, but in practical application, in research, in really digging through to, it's the research term of proof, to prove that a theory is correct or incorrect, a hypothesis is correct or incorrect. That would be fantastic. So that's to me the benefit of a text like this. It's from people who are outside the inner circle, so to speak. We're all independent researchers for the most part. And, we have voices that are a little bit different than the mainstream. And it was a way to pull those voices together and look at them. Not so much look at them. It's not analytic in that way. It's more of a offer them and offer questions to the field that people could then go on their own and explore and debate and just have what I hope to be fantastic conversations around what is this thing we call UDL and how do we use it to better the services that we provide for students and their families. So how's that?
No, that's great. It makes me think about kind of as I got into research myself, right? So a little newer into the field, and one of my mentors pulled me aside as I was getting ready, and she said, your mandate is to be a steward of information for practitioners, because that information, like you said, is going to translate to students. Right. And so I agree with you 100% that we shouldn't separate researchers and practitioners because they have a really symbiotic relationship. And it also makes me think of another experience, which leads into my second question. That same mentor, as I was getting ready to go do an internship at CAST and, dive headfirst into UDL, we were at CEC in St. Louis, and she goes, hey, this is Dave Eddyburn. I want you to talk to him about UDL. And this was 2015, 2016. I forget what year, but a couple of years back. And sat with him for maybe an hour just talking, and reading the book was almost like, an expanded version of that conversation. But I mean, as soon as I open the book, there's that quote, which, you know, he didn't say verbatim to me, but the opening pages of the book suggest having a healthy skepticism or willingness to critically examine theories. As it relates to UDL adoption, implementation, and research globally, why is this important to you?
So reflective teachers are the best teachers, right? That's what we know. We know that people who reflect on their practice grow. And when I think about my own practice, if I don't reflect on things I do well as things that I need to improve, there's a problem there. So if we apply that to the field and to what we do in the field, we should be skeptical. Teachers absolutely have to be skeptical because there are so many things coming at them. And I don't know what you know of me and my practice, but my area that I look most often at is students with more significant support needs, particularly those with intellectual disabilities or multiple disabilities and ASD. And, you know, especially in the field of ASD, there have been so many just cons out there, right? Just educational cons, CONS, that have been perpetuated upon schools, upon families. So it's taught me that, plus being a researcher, of course, has taught me personally to be very skeptical. I think as researchers, we should always be skeptical. But just like in the preface of the book, I tried to ground who I was and where I was coming at this particular set of questions, what sort of mind frame I was coming from as I discussed what the book was going to do. I think that transparency in research is critical, absolutely critical. You know, research must be replicable. There are so many requirements around what is good research and what is not good research. Our skepticism is fueled by being able to read those approaches to inquiry and determine a sense of validity, right? And if that's not there, there's questions left about whether or not what we're reading is factual or not factual, or what was done was factual or not factual. And a practice comes to mind that was created by an insular group that was not allowed to grow out and be transparent. And that practice comes from severe disabilities. It's facilitated communication, right? So these researchers did facilitated communication. They published about it, supposedly making this great change for students, but no one else was allowed to do that. No one else was allowed to replicate those practices in the same way. And you know, what we determine as a field is it's basically not a real thing, right? So when I think about UDL, and I can see the Twitter feed already. Lowry compares UDL to facilitated communication. Do not tweet that. That's not what I'm doing. But what I'll say is the need for that transparency in what we do, the need for that outside questioning, for that picking apart, so to speak, you know, examining each little factor, examining each little variable, looking at the intrinsic implementation, you know, all of those things that fit together to make this framework something is critical. And it's critical for the inside group and it's critical for the outside group. It's critical for all of us to be able to really determine that this is something that can be implemented in a way that brings positive change for students. And if we don't do that, we are left with an insular practice. And actually, Eddie Byrne, a great person to bring up always, but in this conversation, he has a recent chapter that is sort of an answer to his 2010 article, and it's in Gronseth's book. It's about landfills, and I cite it in my chapter. So if you need the reference, it's there. But you know, it's this idea that if we miss the opportunity to really institutionalize, and institutionalize is probably not the right word, but to really take this practice and make it something that is replicable, make it something that people know it when they see it, make it something that is meaningful and comes with this idea that if you use this practice, students are going to benefit from this practice. If we miss that opportunity, we have just an educational fad on our hands, and that runs the risk of being in a landfill. And I personally do not want that to happen. I think that UDL, my belief is that UDL can be very beneficial and inclusive practices for students that I serve. But we're missing a whole lot of opportunities, in my opinion, to really make this a meaningful practice that becomes part of the educational vernacular for years to come, not just a hot topic for now. And I don't want that to happen. It's really important to me that we move that forward. Oh, thanks. Thank you for putting Eddie Burns' thing there. I tried to get him to come. He was doing his editor. I'm the publisher of the book. So anyway, I think that's a really great chapter to read. And actually, I'm going to bring it up again at some point. So that's my thought on that, is that a healthy skepticism is good for anything and everything we do, I think. And maybe I'm just a questioner at heart, but I think it's really important. And I think that students and teachers deserve better than just saying, we believe this is going to work. I just think they deserve more from us as educators than just to say, we believe this is an important thing to do. We should be able to say why.
Right. And so when I read a lot of that stuff, and I'll bring up the 2010 article as well, I agree with you. I think our goal as an educational system is universal design for learning, right? Something that works
Right.
for all students. And I read those why questions as almost like a roadmap. If we answer them, that's our roadmap. And here we are with the Implementation Research Network, right? Focusing on that I. If we answer those why questions, we can, like you said, provide those action steps for implementation. And Kathy, before I ask my next question, I do want you to be able to jump in if you'd like.
And I'm fine with everyone jumping in, to be honest. If Cindy or anyone else has something to say at this point that's on the panel, I'd be happy for them to chime in.
Oh, well, and you've just said so many things that I just want to go, la, 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 la. And the last thing, now, Matt, you just took me in another direction about, you said our goal is for all. I think that's a real question. Is it really for all? One of the big questions, even as I rewrote, so I need to say, we wrote these chapters quite a little time ago. And so I had to reread it again. And in rereading, one of the things that about UDL, I'm going to first say, I have to be on a UDL 12-step program, because I keep saying, I'm not going to do any research in this anymore. I'm going to do AAC where I'm not. And then here I am back because I believe in it to my toenails. But one of the things that's come up for me, even in rereading my chapter today and last week, what do we mean by this margins? Is it the margins between general ed and special ed? Is it the margin that says, okay, you're out in special ed? Is it the margin that means that you're too far out? I don't think so. But these are some of in my chapter, these are some of the things that I tried to question. We have all this language and we use all these words and they mean something, and yet do we have any consensus of what they mean? But I will talk about my chapter in a minute. The other thing that I have to say, based on what Elisa said about practitioners, is I was a practitioner. I was an assistive technology specialist who was, way back in the day, absolutely enamored of this UDL thing. And I would go around and say, oh, do this and it will do, like I would say these things that had no evidence base behind them, because it was what the promise of UD. So give kids um, text to speech and they'll do better. Well, some kids will, but there's a whole bunch of kids that has nothing to do with it. Give kids simulated text. There's a whole bunch of kids that will actually get in the way. So I would go out and preach UDL without really understanding what I was preaching. And then I went to doc school and I tried to become a researcher and try to research this stuff. And I found it was really, really hard because of some of the things that Elisa said. I was totally enamored of these UDL guidelines and the checklists. But when I went to the checklists, it was research informed, not really research guided. There's all kinds of things. So as a practitioner, I really needed that. I really needed to have somebody to say to me, you can't just go off and say these things because there's not an evidence base to them. So that's my piece about what I wanted to say about Elisa, is that it's really important as practitioners that we have good, solid things, not just promises of things to guide us, because otherwise we'll take people in directions that, I'll say it this way. We know that there are finite resources, there are finite windows for people to enter into us with practice. And if we give them stuff that doesn't have a basis in research and that we can't really show works, they're not gonna come back, right? So anyway, those are my things right now. But Matt, I'm gonna come back to you. Is all really our goal? Is it really all, or is it really all to the margin? And what is the margin?
So can I say something about that? I think, and Sean, you got to help me with this. This is Michael's, right? I think the most profound thing I've heard, the most profound question I've heard someone raise about UDL is that if we say that an educational practice is for all, is it comparable to saying that all lives matter, right? Just sort of ignoring the fact that there are people in the margins. There are students who, for various reasons, systemic discrimination is one of them, right? Who are not all, and they matter in a certain way, right? And we need to pay attention. And Sean, you can help expound on that, but it's like, that's a pretty powerful thing for us to think about when we glibly say, lesson design for all, or UDL for all, or we can teach to all if we just use UDL, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is Michael Lackney, who again works at Michigan State, had raised that point in a conversation. And it was sort of at the same time that Cass was doing the symposium last year, really addressing that question about, are we doing enough to be able to consider the cultural and various backgrounds that people bring to the classroom, and how by choosing all and choosing to say all, does that sometimes gloss over or paper over the very real unique elements of people that maybe you then miss in your desire to design for all. And so that word about, I forget, I think it's Louis Olander, who has been pushing a new version of UDL where it's lowercase u, capital D, L, question mark, about being able to, I forget, he's working with, it'll come to me a little bit later. But I mean, the point being that, maybe we should de-emphasize the U a little bit and really get back to focusing on design, the D, because of that concern that Kathy and Cindy and Lisa were just mentioning.
Okay, so then this is a great segue for me to say, who's doing the D? one of the things that my journey has been is starting with the Orcliffe and McLean paper in 1998, which says we're going to design curriculum so that, and they were talking about kids with disabilities. And I just want to say this whole thing about, of course, we need to think about diversity, but all those kids with cultural differences, there's going to be disability within those cultural differences as well. And so how do we really think about that? And who is the people that are the designers? One of the things in my chapter, and one of the things that's important to me, is that we moved from 1998 saying it's going to be curriculum designers to, and I don't know, to, it's going to be teachers that are going to do this. It's going to be instructional designers. And I think so much was lost in that. If we could think about, and in the United States, you're going to say the core curriculum is being designed in a universally designed manner. In my country, if our programs of studies were designed so that every kid could achieve, could see themselves, then the teacher could just take that and differentiate and make it wouldn't be on the backs of teachers. That's one of the things that I really saw in the shift in my chapter, from people designing curriculum. And I know this word curriculum has so many meanings, but I'm going to say curriculum is, what do we expect? What are the state standards? What are the provincial standards? And can we write those standards such that, and those assessments such that we're not excluding kids? We're not, I like to say that again, this is in Canada, I like to say that we design curriculum for 1 standard deviation below and 2 standard deviations above the norm. And anyone else outside that, too bad, so sad, we have to do something very special. So that, anyway, I'm probably talking too much, but that's a real concern to me, is that we've lost this idea of a curricular design. So Sean, thoughts about that?
Oh man, that's a huge question. I'm not sure if we're taking off too far from. I mean, I've seen some of that I've played both roles. So I mean, I was a high school teacher for 10 years, and I came into the profession believing that it was my job to design. That was a big part of it. That was what made it exciting. It was being able to do that work as a history and English teacher. I taught high school. And being able to do that really good work. And the challenge I loved about UDL was the notion of, okay, how do I not ignore the 2 deviations passed and the 1 deviation? I mean, how do I figure out how to be able to really make my classroom as a successful place for every student who was walking into it? And when I became a teacher educator, same deal, right? I mean, how do I convince this group of people I'm training to think the same way? And I get very nervous when I think about my wife, who's a 1st grade teacher, being handed this packet by the state of Oregon and taking away her real gift at being able to design curriculum and saying, well, this is going to cover it for you.
Do you not have state standards?
No, we do. But I mean, again,
are those standards accessible to everyone?
Yes and no. So, we're a fascinating place in the country. I'm not sure who's on the call tonight from our good old Beaver State. But I do think there's a point where, I mean, I just see her not being able to activate some of that talent that allows her to really look at the learning variability that she has in her classes and to be able to respond in kind. I feel like we've moved a little bit away from that politically to where we don't trust to do it.
So now we're getting into it. You heard the word response in kind. Sorry, I'm gonna stop. I want to go proactive, not responsive.
I know.
You're
Okay, I'm
later than
sorry.
I am on wherever you're at. So I mean, you may your brain is. I haven't had that break after work yet. So
When she leans into the computer and that finger comes
go
up,
for me.
you're about to get it, Sean.
I know. This is.
No, I don't mean in a bad way. I mean, it's about to get deep. Yeah, it's about to really get
Go
deep.
ahead, Kathy.
But I
like-
know that Matt has another few questions to go
It's-
before we
Yeah,
actually get
sorry.
into
I'm
chapters.
sorry.
And we need to really overview the book first.
Don't apologize. Don't apologize to me. I'm
I
trying.
told you we're an organic group, that it was just going to grow from the group. I did warn you.
I'm
The
trying to
next
get in on this
episode, Kathy
conversation.
will grill me for the panel. So
No,
that'll be.
no. That's not what I meant at all. Not what I meant at all. She just loves these discussions, as do we all, which is what I hope everybody does with this, right? I hope you sit around and have deep discussions about this. You don't grow if you don't, I mean, reflective people are better people. Let's be reflective in our practice. So
Yeah, so what I want to do is I kind of want to, like I said, I was dying to get in on the conversation, but I didn't want to interrupt. So I'm going to go back to a few of our topics and then try and bridge it into
Okay.
into the next question. So like we talked about, like let's go out and let's report out on this. Let's disseminate this. So I do want to highlight what the IRN has published. I know Dave helped publish some of the reporting guidelines. I really want, I would encourage folks to read those, but also read Kavita's chapter and then read Eric's chapter in the book as well. I know those two folks aren't with us, but taking what's there and then reading their chapters, I think is really going to help you talk about this, doing research and reporting out on it as it relates to UDL. And then Kathy, the language part, just like you, I went in, right? Like with that desire to, how do I help all the students? And like you said, Sean, all the students that come to me, how do I help them succeed? And that's how I found my way to universal design for learning. But then I dug deeper, right? So my path took me to, how can assistive and instructional technology do that? And then you look at the history of what is universal design? So you go to Ron Mace, who did all of that physical environment. I found my way into reading, why does his name escape me now? Former designer for Apple, who did the psychology of everyday things, design of everyday things, that talked about Don something, talked about how we can design physical spaces. And I'm fortunate enough to work in Silicon Valley with all of those people that, do all of the design. And I said, what does, universal design mean for you? And all of that stuff is important. So I don't want to stomp on what we're going to talk about in your chapter, Kathy. So I'll move into the next part. And we've talked about kind of the promise of UDL. Don Norman, thank you. We talk about the promise of UDL, and that's the 2010 article that Dave Eddyburn wrote. And here we are a decade plus later. I don't know if any of us count 2020 as time that moved, or if it was just this standstill thing. But as we enter the next decade of UDL research and implementation, what are the most critical next steps and new directions for researchers and practitioners to take with UDL? Because like you said, I think that there is that symbiotic relationship. And I would also like to have, not only research to practice models, but is there a way for there to be practice to research models as well?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to do is take you back. So 2010, Eddyburn wrote that great article, but in 2006, Waymeyer actually wrote an article about the promise of UDL, which was, probably really fundamental for me in terms of, I was already in the conversation long before that, but when those pieces came out, because it was his and it was June Downing had a piece and it was a special issue. And those were just really instrumental pieces in the world of severe disabilities. And looking at this new framework, I was already thinking about it as something that could promote inclusion. And when those pieces came out, it just sort of stamped it for me that, this is what we need to be thinking about, this promise, this promise, this promise. And when we had the little Q&A at the recent UDL IRN summit, we were talking about how we just can't seem to get, UDL out of special ed world. It just wants to live in special ed world. And that's a problem. If you are going to think about this design framework as as something that applies to inclusive practices, as something that applies to learning in educational environments. And someone brought up the idea of, well, can't special ed be a pilot? And I mean, that's not a bad idea if it was 2010, but it's 2021. So we're talking about a 20-year-old pilot, and it's time to not pilot anymore. It's time to move past that. So when we think about what directions do we need to go in, I do have a point here, I promise. When we think about what directions we need to go in, I mean, first of all, it does need to be upside down right now, right? It needs to be the field of practitioners telling us what they need. My area of research is teacher education, in-service, pre-service teacher education. And I think that we need to go to these places that have done some really nice things in implementation and create partnerships for actual research to see what's going on, to really explore. Will it be critical exploration? Well, when you're skeptical about things, when you're trying to prove a hypothesis, you have to be critical, but critical doesn't mean bad. It doesn't mean that you're putting a school district on display for what they're doing incorrectly. We don't know what's correct and incorrect. So how could we ever say that? What we need to do is really look at large scale implementation, at small scale implementation, and really tease out some of those things that were just happening on the panel. Those topics that were just being debated, on the panel itself, because we don't know. Some of us come at this with all means all, and some of us come with this at, I actually sat in on a lunch years ago at a CEC in, oh my God, that place outside of DC, whatever that place is. I don't know. Kathy,
Baltimore.
No, not Baltimore.
No?
You take the ferry across and it's
yes, you're trapped.
Yes. I can't think of what it's called. Anyway, we had a great conversation about, is it 98%? Because that was the days of No Child Left Behind and the 2% rule, and so people were actually positing the idea of, well, that 2% didn't actually fit into UDL, which of course hurt me to my soul. But, what new directions do we need to go in? We need to tease out all these things. We need large scale implementation. We need small scale implementation. We need to look at, what are people calling UDL? I was recently on a webinar where people talked about everything. They literally said, everything can be UDL. Well, if everything can be UDL, then nothing is UDL. If it's so ambiguous that we can just put everything in there, then we can't study it. And, and we can't say to teachers, oh, it's just everything. That's not okay. That we owe practitioners, we owe students, we owe families more than just saying, well, it's everything you do. It's not, it can't be. So we need to think about that in terms of design and in terms of the framework and how the framework applies. Is the frame, here's where I'm going to send you back to Eddie Burns' chapter, because he has really fantastic, of course he does, recommendations for future things that we need to do. And one of those things is that whole idea of operationally defining UDL. We've never done that. We've never, ever done that. Identifying the active ingredients of UDL, what Gardner loves to talk about, how much is enough? At what point do you tip the scales to say this is UDL? And at what point do you take something off the scales to say this is not UDL? And then we really need those measurements of outcomes of the actual interventions. So all of those recommendations, sad to say, have been around pretty much since the beginning, and we haven't done them. And we need to try harder, self-included. And so what I really want to say about, as we look at this text and where it came from, because Kathy's right, this has been, I can't even believe people still let their chapters be in it because it took so long for us to get it out. It was an idea that was conceived years ago. People wrote in a breakneck speed, and then we just ran into some publication problems in terms of just logistics. But these ideas are still, when I read it to this day, nothing got old. And that makes me kind of sad. Like, you know, we should have had a lot more information, and we didn't have a lot more. In some cases we had more information, but we didn't have a lot more information. And that makes me sad. And we need to hold ourselves to a higher bar as a field educationally. You know, students, particularly the students that I serve, their educational services, K-12 services, are the best they're ever going to get. That's it. That's the best they're going to get. And we need to make sure that we provide the best that we can possibly offer. And so providing that through a belief system is not good enough. We need to provide that through evidence that we know it's going to make a change for that student in their life and in the rest of their 60 years on this earth, or whatever it may be, right? Sometimes we get hung up on that graduation date. And then of course we look at this through, you know, all the other lenses, post-secondary, you know, it's being looked at in employment and other types of environments. But we really have to know what we're talking about. And I'm not sure we do. And that remains a question for me. And so, you know, when we talk about it as a belief, or I believe in this, and I do that, I talk about it that way, it feels very religious to me. And we need it to be a very fundamental, identified practice. I've been rejected with enough articles on UDL with notes from editors that I respect very, very much, that say this is not an evidence, there's not enough evidence to support this practice. So when Jeff's not on tonight, he's on a motorcycle somewhere. He texted me a few minutes ago, but when he makes that Bigfoot analogy, I get where that's coming from. You know, I totally get that, because I have put research studies out there to editors only to get back, this is not a practice that we're interested in because there's not evidence to support it. And that makes me sad. You know, we've got to do better.
Yeah.
And maybe it's I'm a bad writer, but which is probably true, if you've ever read anything I've written. But we just have to do better. So when I think about what has to come next, you know, pretty much everything has to come next. It's wide open. I think that's the good message here tonight, is it's wide open for any school district that is interested in partnering with the researcher, for any teacher that's interested in partnering with the researcher, for any state that's interested in doing some partnerships. It's wide open. But if we miss this opportunity, we run the risk of being an educational fad that ends up in the landfill that Eddie Burns is talking about. Kathy, release, go.
This is, oh, Kathy, sorry.
I want to hear from Cynthia because we haven't heard from Cynthia. But I guess I also need to say that I came to my doc studies trying to, with the total belief that I was going to study UDL, but I couldn't operationalize it. I could not operationalize it. Was it going to be, 12 of the, 6 of the guidelines? What was it going to be? And I walked away because I could not do that. It was too complicated. I also worked for the Ministry of Education in Alberta, and we worked really hard to try and take that to say, we're going to create guidelines, not for curriculum developers, because, oh my God, we couldn't do that, but for textbook developers. And we had those guidelines, and that didn't happen either. So I have these many, many levels of promise, but anyway, so that's enough for me. Cynthia, you haven't talked yet. We want to hear from you.
I talked. I think that I get frustrated even in listening to us sit here on this panel, that, we are rightfully so, kind of critical of the field for not operationalizing UDL. But how the hell would you do that? I mean, how would you operationalize? Like, what is it? 3 principles? What? And in our chapter, which I think we actually delve into some of these issues about the challenges and the limitations of the conceptual framework of UDL. Not arguing that the principles and practices don't have some consensus in the research, but just the way things are conceptualized, right, in boxes as checklists. And we're so fortunate, Sean and I are, to work with Rand Spiro, who developed cognitive flexibility theory, right? And Rand can't be here tonight. He has a case of vertigo, but wow, it talks about learning in complex domains. That's what CFT is, cognitive flexibility theory. Very, very influential theory in educational psychology and in educational technology, and many other fields as well. So anyway, that's a little plug for Rand's work because it's wonderful. But his work shows that this is really complicated. Teaching, particularly if we're trying to think about how to design and teach for all, is extremely ill-structured, extremely complicated. And to have these kind of templates or kind of these views of this is UDL, it's got, we're going to say it's UDL if it has 3 principles and 6 guidelines, right? That makes it UDL. It's really complicated. And so, we've kind of tried to explore how could we change just the whole conceptual framework of UDL, how people think about it. So it's not reductive, right? So that it's not simplistic. And lesson planning, and Sean could speak more to this, is another example. It's a template, right? And Rand's research and others show that when you reduce something complicated to a template, there are dangers in doing things that way because people tend to ignore the complexity. And I often think that's what we do in the UDL field, is we really have closed our eyes to the complexity. I don't have an answer, but it is a big concern. So I want to give Sean the chance to chime in because we've done this work together. So.
Oh yeah, no, I would draw people's attention to that part of the chapter that Rand was able to offer his 2 cents on where to be able to move in this particular case, and to focus on using cases and mini cases as a clear means of helping people to be able to get through that novice phase and to understand the rich complexity of what's happening in classrooms. I just finished my dissertation work. And I was struggling with that particular notion of how to go back to my own training as a teacher and where lesson plans would trip me up. And even that false notion of being able to take one of the guidelines and just stick it into what I was thinking of doing in that particular classroom. I mean, it was good at a very particular point in time early in my career, but I mean, it never really covered the complexity that I think is there. And I think that if you scan that chapter towards the end where Rand is speaking about what would it mean to be able to move people away from oversimplification, it's not going to be simple. How do you move people through a template phase? Like, how do you get them to a place where they're able to really delve into that design a lot more deeply by understanding the richness that's in an ill-structured domain? I think it's a worthy exploration, and what made it really fascinating to be able to consider the questions that Elisa asked us, and to be able to think about what's out there that practitioners have to deal with. Even in my own, I hadn't taught in a high school classroom in a decade, and going back this last month in COVID with 9th graders and trying to do this. I mean, it was very tricky again. Again, it was good to have that experience of being able to be there. And those of you on the call tonight who are practitioners, my goodness, what a challenging time, and I'm glad I experienced it to be able to really have some further empathy. But I mean, it raises a lot of questions about how are we going to learn from this and be able to do, or take those next steps going into this, 3rd decade of UDL, and to be able to make those next steps when it comes to answering some of those research questions.
Yeah, so I want to respond to that for just a second, if that's okay. So I want to be sure that I'm clear that I completely agree that we have, self-included, have oversimplified certain practices, because at the end of the day, people want that nuts and bolts pieces, right? They want to know, how do I fill in this blank? How do I do this particular thing? But more and more I'm coming to understand, and maybe I'm just late to the ball game, which is why I had to work on this book to get good information from other people, is that maybe what we shouldn't be studying is the UDL framework. Maybe what we should be studying is, systems implementation and how people think about things and how they make decisions based on the information in this framework. And all kinds of questions come to mind. And I think that there's room for everybody, right? I think there's room for this is what you do on a daily basis kind of thing. And there's room for how do we think about this in terms of our system, in terms of how complicated it is. And that's part of my transparency issue. I think sometimes the message is, let's just do UDL, whatever doing UDL actually is, and the world's going to be a better place. But the truth is, it's very, very complicated to design in this manner. It's incredibly complicated. And if we should be honest about that, we have to be honest about that up front. We owe that to teachers and families and students, that this is complicated and there's no clear this isn't. And so I don't ever want to say that I'm on the bus of 3 guidelines and 2 checkpoints and you're a winner, that you're ding, ding, you win the fair prize. That's not it. But I do think how people contemplate those guidelines and checkpoints, how they use those in their curriculum design, it's critically important that we explore that. And I hope all types of questions come out of this, right? I hope people go for the most simplistic question to the deepest, most complicated question, because they're all there. That's what I was trying to say earlier. We haven't answered a lot of them, and we need to try. So I appreciate everybody.
I don't want to dismiss the importance of checklists. And, your pilot in the plane goes through a checklist before he takes off. Thank God, right? Your surgeon does that as well, right? Even though these are highly experienced people that go through the checklist. But, that's not going to help them land a plane in the Hudson River, right? So, it's just like, that's what we're kind of interested in, is going beyond, right? How do we get to the point where you can land a plane in the Hudson River if you need to,
Well, and I think that there are different opinions on that in the field. So there are those who are strong proponents of, we really need to make this simple and easy to practice because teachers are busy. And if we go in saying, being honest with them that this is a complex design process that's iterative and will take time, they won't want to be involved. So I think there's a strategicness in terms of how we frame it at first, as there are some things that you can do using UDL checkpoints and principles to address known issues in your class tomorrow, right? To start to make a change. And then when you have some time, let's pull back and reassess the whole thing using this design frame. I think we can approach it in both ways, and there's a strategicness to that. The problem that I sometimes see, and that I'm encountering as I'm writing a paper right now addressing the critiques of UDL, is that UDL is often framed in so many different ways that by different people in different circumstances, it ceases to have any meaning at all. It's like all things to all people, and that opens it up to, somebody's critiquing this interpretation of UDL, and I don't agree with that interpretation of UDL, but I don't solely have the authority to say that interpretation is wrong, because a lot of people are using that interpretation, as the more simplified bottom up, as opposed to the systemic design thinking, which I agree with Alyssa. That's how I like to see it. But both, I would say, are equally represented in the UDL community. And so I don't necessarily think we need to come to consensus, but we need to be honest that there are different perspectives and different approaches to UDL that have value, but that are different from each other. And so what defines UDL in that complex, multifaceted system?
Thanks, everybody. That's Eric Moore, by the way. He popped on, he had to teach tonight, so.
Fashionably late. I'm sorry, I had a class that changed schedule last minute thanks to COVID.
It's okay. So yeah, I think that's, Matt, I know you were going to jump in earlier, and I hope you will again, because we're getting close to the end of the hour. But, that's the murkiness of this text, I think, which is so, every chapter there are chapters that are very simple in nature that really deal with one issue and deal with that very overtly. You know, there's like a ABC formula in play. And then there are chapters like Kathy's and Cindy's and Eric's that really push some critical inquiry, right? That push you to think. I think all of them push you to think, quite frankly. I think all of them really ask you to reflect on your practice and to reflect on where you are in your thinking. And for me, as editor of the book, that's all I could ask, right? Is that people read these chapters with an open mind and spend some time with your colleagues talking about it. And then after you talk about it, spend some time trying to figure out what you're going to do about it. You know, what are you going to do about your thoughts? Because that's what we need. We need this one of the key features of UDL is the iterative process, right? So if we do what Eric just described, which is go through some of these more simplistic ideas and then build towards the more complicated pieces, or maybe you deal with the complex pieces first and then go to the day-to-day stuff, you're circling constantly. You're never done. And we have to be honest and transparent about that with this particular package of thoughts about education. So Matt, take it away. Take us away.
No, this is one of the reasons I miss getting to go to conferences, right? You go to conferences, you do your presentation, then you meet someone in a cool city at a nice place to eat, and you have conversations like this till late in the evening. It's my favorite part of being an academic, but it's also important to keep in mind the things we've talked about all night is we have these conversations, and then how do we then move them and transition those into things that practitioners can use? As each of you is talking, what Kathy said resonated with me about we go in, we want to dig and we want to find answers. Cindy, brought up something that Cindy and Eric, we want it to be simple, but we want it to be usable. I remember in my dig, like finding a surgeon who was on President Biden's transition team who explicitly writes about the benefits of checklists in surgery and how can we apply that to education. And Elisa, you've talked about all night, like the importance of how people that are getting into research or people that want to do research, having that critical inquiry or just that framework of like wanting to find answers is so important. So we're at 6 o'clock. I do want to see if there are any questions. And just encourage everyone that's here, like just dig in and read. I mean, push and push back has been what's driven everything, right? Without Tesla, there's no Edison or Westinghouse. You need, Kathy's laughing at my reference, but there's got to be push and push back, I think, and it's good, right? That's why we started talking about why is skepticism, critical inquiry, why is all of that important? Because I think it pushes us all forward. So I know there are a couple questions. Can we include a table of contents for the chapters and authors on the website? That might be a question for Dave as the publisher.
Yeah. I'll ask. I can ask.
And then I know there was another question asked earlier, Lisa, that might be a question for you, is for folks that want to get the book internationally. I know there's an ebook option, but if they wanted to get a hard copy, is there a date?
I don't know that answer. I can ask Dave that information and send it to Mackenzie as well. It's not currently available on Amazon. There's all sorts of extra stuff that comes with making something available on Amazon. And as you know, Knowledge by Design is a small publishing house. So I will ask, Dave is that is his publishing house. So I will have a conversation with Dave and get that information back to Mackenzie. But right now you could buy the ebook, which instantly appears, or you could buy the printed book internationally. I'm not sure about the date there, but I can ask for shipping. So I'll ask that and give that to Mackenzie. And what are the updates that CAST is making to the framework? We don't have Jamie or Jose on they have a chapter in the book. And so this group is while we probably all have a little bit of information about that, I'd prefer for us not to address that because that's not our employer, I guess is what I'll say.
What I will say though is talking about the updates and anything, it's touched on in the chapters throughout. I know Kathy's chapter talks about the evolution. It's important to dig in. I think, again, read anything you can get your hands on the subject. And I know Elizabeth has a question, and Eric's typing, and I'll pose it to the panel as well. So who should operationally define UDL, a single researcher or a committee? I think that's a question that I grapple with all the time. And Elisa, you were speaking about, you submit something. It's like the power dynamic of publishing in higher ed, right? If it has UDL, some people will just say no.
Or some people still send it back with, could you provide 2 chapters explaining what UDL actually is, in your intro? What I will say is there have been meetings. There's a great paper out. Sean Smith is first author on that, about, I think it was in Journal of Disability Policy Studies, maybe in 2019, that there was a whole meeting trying to look at how to define UDL, what practices do we need, all this kind of stuff. And, at the end of the day, we come back to exactly what Kathy said and what Sean said. You just get lost in that. You get lost there because it's so very difficult to define. So, I'm probably moving more to the thoughts and have in the last few years that maybe what we do is come up with the closest a definition as we possibly can about this amalgamous thing, but maybe it's not what we consider an operational definition, because maybe we're going to view it through some different lenses than how we might view. This is not intervention research, right? This is not going to be that, because UDL is a framework. It's not it's not an intervention that you're going to put into place and measure the outcomes in that same way. We have to think, Cindy's point on, Cindy and Sean, you have to think about different ways to look at it, different ways to measure, what are we actually measuring, and those are the questions we really need to dig down to. So that's why I'm hoping novice researchers and some of us who are not so jaded, probably not me, will really consider new ways to examine this idea, this set of theories, this set of practices that really are comprehensive. 31 checkpoints, my goodness. And so then, and it's not just the checkpoints. You've got to add in variability. You've got to add in the iterative process. You've got to add in all these other things that aren't actually on that little chart of principles, guidelines, and checkpoints, right? So it's complicated and it's complex, and we need to be transparent about our journey through that. Otherwise, everybody gets lost in the woods. So if you've got a breadcrumb, disseminate that breadcrumb and help a sister out. That's what we need to do, is just help each other get through the woods, right? And Eric's spot on. There's no one right way. We all have different things that we value, our experiences. Like I tried to say in the preface, my lens is completely colored by my time and my service to students with significant disabilities and my background and training as a curriculum designer for those students, so everybody comes at it different, and that makes it great. That's what makes it rich. So keep sharing. I think that's really important. These conversations are important. Action plans are more important. Conversations create the action plans.
So I just want to leave it to anyone on the panel. I think we've answered all the questions that have been brought our way fully, or as fully as we can.
Where'd Kathy go?
And I think Kathy had to jump off a little bit early.
Okay.
And I know we are a little bit over on time, so I do want to try and get us all out of here as close to what we agreed to as possible. So are there any closing thoughts, statements, or anything anyone would like to add before we get out of here for the evening?
I just want to point out that even in the absence of an operationalized hard and fast definition of UDL, Anecdotally, socially, we know that UDL is working from the way we've seen it transform our own classrooms, our own careers, the systems and groups that we've worked with. Oftentimes, UDL causes people to do practices that we know those practices exist. We know that that's a good practice, and people get caught up with, well, it's the fact that they're captioning their videos. It's the fact they're giving their students choices that reflect their cultural values and so forth. That's what's helping, not UDL. But it's often been said about modern art, that like, well, I could have done that, but you didn't. And that's what makes it modern art. And so often that's what I see, is that people who, you could have done that, but you didn't until you started thinking with a UDL lens. That mindset that transforms our practice really works. And so if we get too hung up in the weeds of, yeah, but we can't drill it down, we miss out on the opportunity of the fruit that UDL has borne and is bearing still.
So if I could share a related anecdote, I taught a course in UDL to undergraduates, and I would typically ask some of my former students to come back and just do a little guest spot after they had been out in the classroom for a couple of years. So one time I had this student come back. His name was Brad, and he taught in Chicago public schools, very different than East Lansing public schools, where Michigan State's located. But he was talking to the students about UDL and how he uses UDL. And his conclusion about the value of UDL was phrased like this: learning about UDL is kind of like seeing your parents naked. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I thought that was great. It's just what you're saying, Eric, right? Like, that's not going to come out as a, somewhere as a data point in a research study, but wow, that kind of perspective shift, is really something that's important. So.
And Sean, did you want to add anything before?
I can only disagree. No, sorry, no, I'm joking. I can only agree at this particular stage of the evening. No, I think that having been a high school teacher, and again, working with teacher candidates, it is like once you start talking about all of the variations of people out there, because their experience was such that they hadn't always encountered that. When they're exposed to UDL, it does allow them an opportunity to say, how could I not be doing this? Right? If I really love children, and I love being able to help children with being able to reach their aspirations, how can I not aspire to make something like this work? And I think that's why we all keep coming back to it, right? I mean, part of this is that we know there are complexities to still try to be able to resolve, but we keep pushing because we know that the goal here is the right goal, which is to be able to help children with reaching their most highest potential, like, wherever they are, however they are.
I think that's a great sentiment to end on. Again, everyone get out there, answer these questions that we've posed. I'll plug one last chapter just because this conversation made us think about it. What Eric and Sean were saying, read Alex's chapter in the book because it kind of hits on those topics as well. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. We went a little bit over, so thank you for working overtime with us. And I hope when we're able to get back into